welcome back to the channel. Today I will be talking about everything that I read in August. So this is all the physical books, but I also read a bunch of ebooks this month. I've been finding it easier just to read on the e-reader, especially during my commutes. And so yeah, the first book I read this month is Martyr. The first thing I wrote down in my book review, this is easily one of my favorite reads of this year. Wow. So the novel is basically about Cyrus, who is a young man grappling with an inheritance of violence and loss because his mom's plane was shot down over the skies in the Persian Gulf in what Goodreads or in the blurb writes as a senseless accident, and his father's life in America is also circumcised by the type of work that he does as an immigrant. And so Cyrus grew up with a very troubled childhood, and he is a drunk, an addict, and a poet who is obsessed with the martyrdom and the idea of, I don't know if it's necessarily becoming a martyr, but I think obsessed with the idea of making his life count and to making an impact on the world with his life. I remember vividly while reading this novel that all the concepts and ideas that were floating around in the book just kept lingering in the back of my mind during the process I was reading it. So I would read it on the commute and then I'd be thinking about it like at home, and I'd just be processing and thinking about the concepts that were mentioned and kind of the ideas that were brought up within this book. I think it brought up some ideas of depression and the ideas of struggling to find a purpose or struggling to attain a level of purpose in life. And all those thoughts really resonated with me, or have resonated with a me in the past. And I just thought the entire book was so expertly executed. The precision of the pacing, the word choice was all done so well, and I was just so in awe with the author. I also really enjoyed his depiction of generational trauma, depression, and the heavy colonial/assimilation themes that were so expertly portrayed in a very vulnerable and raw way. And I really enjoyed how in the novel, nothing felt like it was exaggerated for the sake of kind of not clickbait, but like to kind of hook or entice the reader into reading more. Everything felt very genuine and very rooted in lived experiences rather than sensationalism. Oh, I also realized while I was reading Martyr that I really enjoy introspective novels and novels that delve into characters' thoughts and their feelings and how they process those emotions, because I feel like when I read about books that don't go into that character introspection, I quickly lose interest and it doesn't hook me on an intellectual level. And so that was something I realized while I was reading Martyr, and I was like, oh, okay, so this is the type of genre of books I actually enjoy. And the next book I read this month was White Nights by Dostoevsky, and I have to say that was a huge letdown of a book. I don't know why everyone on TikTok and social media really hypes up White Nights and they romanticize it, and they make like romance fantasy edits of how like, oh, like his name is not even mentioned, but I forgot the girl's name, but like the girl's name is like mentioned X amount of times. It's so romantic. But I found White Nights super misogynistic, and it was kind of scary how the male character would never understand no and just keep pushing his affections towards the young girl in the novel. And I don't know if that's what Dostoevsky intended. I hope that's what he's intended, but I found it very unnerving how, despite her constant insistence on setting boundaries and asserting that he was just a brotherly relationship to her, he kept trying to push those boundaries and try to like go through the cracks of those boundaries to like force his affection and force her to acknowledge his affection for her. Maybe I'm just like a pessimist, but I found that novel super unnerving, and I absolutely hated it because it had no philosophy. And so I was just reading about a guy who didn't understand no, but there was no Dostoevsky philosophy behind it, so I didn't know what I was reading. I really didn't enjoy that read. And a book I've been slowly working my way throughout this month is Metamorphosis. I haven't actually finished this novel. Oh, I should clarify that this is Ovid's Metamorphosis, not Kafka's. This is a collection of short poems detailing transformation, and I really enjoyed reading this, actually. I think this is an easier poem. I don't know if it's the translation, but I found it a lot easier to tackle than the Iliad or the Odyssey by Homer. The language used is just easier for my brain to understand. I also love reading about mythologies, and when I was younger, I loved reading Greek myth and just learning about those mythical explanations of the world because I feel like it makes the world seem so much more whimsical and magical rather than just like cold hard science. I especially love the story of Arachne, which is in this collection of poems as well, about how Arachne is a young girl who was an expert weaver, and then she challenged one of the gods, and as punishment for being so overly confident and so disrespectful of the god turned her into a spider so she could continue weaving forever. And I think that's just such a beautiful explanation or lore to spiders that makes them seem a little more human and like a little bit more magical in a way, even though I would still probably scream if I saw a spider. I really enjoy slowly making my way through these collection of poems. I feel like whenever I crack one open, it's very low commitment. I just read one or two poems and I can put it down, set it aside for another day. I also read Right by Sarah Rose Etter this month. I kept this in my TBRs because I just started a corporate job, so I knew that I would want to read corporate related novels just because I feel like sometimes reading about books that reflect your current life is sometimes fascinating and fun to do, while sometimes I like to read to transport me to another world. This was a pretty interesting read. I thought it'd be more weird than it actually turned out to be. This is about a young girl who is working her dream job at a cutthroat Silicon Valley, and it talks about how the work culture is very bad and very heavy on constant attainment, achievement, and like meeting corporate goals instead of a proper work-life balance. I think it's anxiety or depression, but she has this giant black hole, not a metaphorical one in her head. Like she actually sees this giant black hole that just follows her around wherever she goes. And I assume it's a metaphor for her anxiety and her stress levels, but it's an interesting way to express emotions, and I thought that was pretty interesting to read about. And there's also little facts about black holes because she's also fascinated by black holes that are littered throughout this book, which I thought was really cute. Not cute, but like it was a cute concept to add to the book. And yeah, it's kind of just like a story about a young girl trying to reconcile how her life kind of sucks because it's been overtaken by this job and she gets mistreated by others, and how she's grappling with being a woman in the workplace, and how being a younger member of the team, often her accomplishments goes towards her seniors, and the credit, and she's not actually given credit for her work. And while I don't personally relate to the situation in this book that much, I just thought it was interesting to read about. It was interesting enough to read about that I finished it in, I think, 2 or 3 days, but not something that was super memorable and something that I would push for others to read. But if you happen to come across this book, or if it sounds intriguing to you, I would say read it. It's like a pretty good book to just pass time. And then I read The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. This book took me quite a bit of time to go through. I think this happens when I read older books, such as books from Jane Austen, and just novels that use older English, especially set in society, like high society books, because they have so many term uses or like things they talk about that is so out of context and not of contextual norm to modern day society that I have to like figure out what they're talking about before I actually understand what they're talking about. Overall, yeah, this read like a Jane Austen novel where it talks about kind of a forbidden love almost. Yeah, it is a forbidden love. The entire premise of this book is basically kind of this love triangle between Archer, his fiance, and the fiance's cousin. And then reading this, I felt like I was on a roller coaster because I think at first I quite liked Archer because he is a bit of a feminist. He has feminist ideals. I think one of the quotes I particularly liked was kind of asking like, oh, like, why are you criticizing this woman when her only crime is marrying an asshole of a man? Like, why are you making her to be the culprit? Like, Why should she slink as if it were she who had disgraced herself? She's poor Ellen, certainly, because she had the bad luck of making a wretched marriage, but I don't see that that's reason for hiding her head, as if she was the culprit. Originally I liked him quite a bit, and then I got really confused because I'm like, wait, he has a fiance. Why is he lusting about this cousin? Because I sometimes I don't read blurbs, I just jump into books, so I was so confused because I was like, whoa, this is not right. And then near the middle of the book, I got a little annoyed with him because despite him having certain feminist ideologies, he still seemed very kind of white male privilege, asserting the fact that he likes her and trying to make a situation happen despite knowing the consequences or the backlash that that situation would create would fall more on the woman than on him. And so I got a little annoyed with him. But I think the ending of the book made me happy. It satisfied me and it didn't make me feel morally indignant and like super outraged about the ending. Yeah, I think in my journal I wrote that I really enjoyed this book and how it spoke to feminism, social conventions, and practices that represented the elite alongside romantic undertones of the entire story. And so overall, I did enjoy this read, and I think the ending of the novel redeemed the entire novel for me and made it like it rose from like a 3-star to like a 5, 6, 7-star book for me. The next book I read is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang in preparation for Katabasis and to get ready for her style of writing. So Yellowface, I feel like the title is pretty explanatory of what the book entails. It is about a white author who is very jealous of her friends who is an Asian woman who writes about. And one day they are drinking together and they're making pancakes, and Athena, who is her friend, chokes and dies on a piece of mini pancake. And so June, who's the main character of this novel, decides to steal her manuscript and to publish it as her own. I think when I was reading this, I couldn't help but draw parallels between Athena and R.F. Kuang's own history as a writer. A lot of the traits that Athena had, I kind of thought it was based off of R.F. Kuang herself, like how she achieved literary fame at a very young age, and how she writes more academic influenced novels that are based on Asian colonial history. I think it was also mentioned that a criticism against Athena's novel is that they're too dense and they're very academic and they feel very pretentious. And I just couldn't help but notice how R. Kwang also kind of gets that sort of criticism. I thought that was kind of funny how Athena kind of reflected R. Kwang as an author. In my journal, I said that I love this read. I think, yeah, this is very different from R.F. Kuang's other books. I didn't really expect a literary fiction novel to be this light in a sense and less, because I think most of her novels deal with very heavy themes and very serious themes, but I feel like while this one does deal with serious themes, it does it in a very lighthearted way, and it's a very implicit part of this novel instead of a very core substantial part of a plot like Babel or The Poppy War does. And yeah, because of the parallels between Athena and R.F. Kuang, I couldn't help but kind of feel that this novel had her own personal reflections and her own thoughts and feelings about her journey as an author kind of littered and seeped through this novel, which I really enjoyed. It gave me a bit of insight into R.F. Kuang as an author herself and kind of the feelings and things she struggles with. I really enjoyed the question of who deserves to tell what stories, and the idea of how do certain people, because of their race, ethnicity, or citizenship, or their generational history, deserve to tell certain stories more than others. And I think that's a very thought-provoking question, because while there can be arguments made for being why those people are better suited to tell those stories, I think R.F. Kuang herself also mentions in an interview of how gatekeeping who is allowed to tell those stories is also very problematic, as it makes these stories more difficult to circulate and more difficult to get out there, because the voices that are marginalized are often voices that are not heard, and if those are the people we deem to be the only appropriate people to tell those stories, then those stories may never end up being heard. And so I really appreciated her take on that and kind of having those themes littered and stagnated across this novel. It was like I thought that was a very interesting question to raise. Enjoyed how she questions if detailing the history of suffering or detailing suffering of the past is sort of exploitative of those victims. I think why these questions appealed so much to me because they don't have the straightforward answers, and yet they're so relevant to contemporary society and the way we talk about things today. Well, my own personal opinion that detailing this sort of suffering is not necessarily in itself exploitative. I do acknowledge that it depends on the context, especially such as context in this book. How the author narrates that sort of lived experience and their intention behind it does really matter. And so overall, I really enjoy this book. I don't think it's my favorite R.F. Kuang book. I think my favorite is still Katabasis or the Poppy Wars series, but I think if you're someone who wants to get into R.F. Kuang, this is a great gateway to start because I feel like it's less dense and academic compared to other books, but at the same time it does entail some of those really philosophical questions and hard-hitting questions that R.F. Kuang is known for and is what I appreciate about her as an author, but also it has the humor and the lightheartedness of a literary fiction. And of course, this month is the Katabasis release, and I finished that book in a week. I was traveling while I was reading that, but I was still reading on the car, and I just enjoyed that book so much. I really did enjoy Katabasis a lot. I have a short form video on my Instagram and TikTok that's a more shorter, condensed. I don't think I could condense a review on Katabasis. But I'll try not to repeat what I said. I think I'll still repeat what I said, but I'll try to word it differently. But I think Katabasis, one of the main things I took away from that book is I enjoyed it so much because R.F. Kuang really beautifully encapsulated how I feel when I'm studying philosophy during my undergraduate degree, how I was so fascinated by theories, and how every time I learned about a new theory that would undermine a previous theory I learned, or when I learned about paradoxes, I would be so in awe of the world and how people can be so intellectual and how people can think of such grandiose theories that I never thought of. And it just made me feel like the world is such a magical place, and like ideas and thoughts are so magical and they're just so enlightening that I felt like I was in this magical realm. And I think R.F. Kuang really beautifully captures that feeling of being in a magical place by literally placing philosophy in the magical realm and making it a form of magic. I also like how she spelled magic in the book. She spells it with a K, which is very interesting. I like those little like unique twists on things that are not necessarily important. I don't know if it's important. It might be important in her novel. I don't know if she talks about it in her interviews, but like little twists that make something a little bit more unique. As someone who loves philosophy, loves learning about the philosophy of logic, this book definitely was right up my alley. I totally understand if someone who's not necessarily as interested in philosophy might find this book very dense, very heavy on academia, very heavy on introducing concepts that someone might not really care about, which is totally fair. I think everyone has different interests in that is what makes the world work, because if we all have the same interests, like Kant's categorical imperative, then the world just wouldn't work because we'd all be grouped into this one subsection of a genre, and like how else would there be developments in the other side of the world? I think I was fangirling over philosophers that were mentioned, like Parfit. I think Moore was also mentioned in a novel, and whenever philosophers get name dropped in fiction novels, I just get really excited because it's like name dropping a really famous musician that you know of, which is kind of weird because I'm talking about like old philosophers, like 18th, 16th century philosophers. But yeah, I was just really excited to read about philosophical theories that I learned about in undergrad put in a very fictional and very contemporary setting. So for example, Parfit was mentioned in relation to the transitivity of identity and the idea of how identity works, basically, to kind of keep it concise and short. There's a lot of theories out there regarding what our identity consists of. One famous one would be Descartes' I think, therefore I am. He thinks because we are thinking beings, and because we are thinking, we can from that premise that I am thinking, I can establish that I am something that exists. I am not a brain in a vat. Parfit thinks that identity is about relationship R. He doesn't really specify what this R is. He just says it's the right connectedness of memories, and he kind of leans into the Buddhist ideas of identity, where identity is not like a solid thing, but rather it's about having enough connectedness with memories or the previous thing, and that constitutes you. So it kind of suggests that you can reincarnate into different things, and that identity is not rooted in this singular soul or metaphysical body. So yeah, that's kind of a very short synopsis. There's a lot more behind the metaphysics of identity, and I just love how it was incorporated in the book. I think I was just being a geek. Yeah, as I mentioned before, I get why people might find Kwang's book very boring. Personally, I feel like there are certain parts that feel like she's lecturing or just explaining concepts, and it does almost feel like you're like pulled out of that plot or that fantasy realm that Peter and Alice are in. But at the same time, I feel like it's worth the trade-off because it adds more to the world, and it's a necessary component in order for her to use philosophical ideas and themes in a fiction novel, because without that understanding, nothing would make sense. So I think it's a fair trade-off, and I was totally fine with it, and I appreciated her taking the time to explain those concepts instead of just like throwing them in there. And while I was reading this book, I was wondering kind of how I would classify R.F. Kuang's book, and I feel like her novels kind of fall into a different genre where it's not strict fiction. There's a lot of kind of academia fiction where philosophical ideas or history is littered well into the book, where it feels like it takes up a part of the book and the book is not just pure fiction. So I think get why people who approach this as a fiction novel or as a fantasy novel will feel very weirded out by the book or dislike the book in a way. In my notes, I wrote that for some people, her novels may feel disorganized and too far from the conventional linear plotline that most fantasy fiction books follow. And so I totally understand the criticism, but for me personally, I don't mind that, and I like that kind of intellectual endeavor that she kind of forces you and takes you along on. I also read some of the CVs of the people that R.F. Kuang acknowledged in her acknowledgement at the end of the book at MIT Philosophy, and I realized that they do very interesting research, and they all just genuinely seem like really cool and exciting people. They would seem like really cool people who just really love academia and philosophy, and like I would love to sit down with them and just chat with them about philosophy. They seem like really cool people. I thought that was just a interesting tidbit to mention. The last book I read is On Being Blue by William H. Gass. I think I've been reading so much fiction novels that when I read this book, I was so thrown off because it's not a fiction novel. It's more of a philosophical inquiry into the color blue. I thought it'd be more focused on one specific concept of blue. I don't know why I implicitly thought it'd be more about like emotions and what blue means as an emotion, but the book just talks about everything related to blue. It started with the linguistics of color and what linguistically blue entails, and how historically blue can mean different things in different contexts, and how if blue is a color in itself or is it a perceivement of the mind. And then it kind of jumps into the metaphysical nature of color, which I just briefly touched on about, and how color is not necessarily an external thing that exists in the world, but rather is an object, or I guess an entity or an idea that exists in our brain and is perceived in our brain rather than something that's actually physically there in the external world, which kind of touches upon the epistemology of color. And so I think I felt like I was like a rag doll being like thrown around in this book. And I think because I've been reading so much fiction novels, suddenly being thrown into an academic piece of writing was a little bit jarring. But I do like reading books that challenge me from time to time, keeps me on my toes, and I also feel like sometimes it feels nice to be humbled, and like it feels nice to feel like you don't know anything. I don't know if that makes any sense, but overall I pretty enjoy that read. It's like I learned some things I never knew about before, and it brought back some memories from studying philosophy, but I felt like this novel was not specific enough to posit a theory. He just kind of glazed over a bunch of ideas. And so the takeaway from this book is a little convoluted and confusing because there's not one like single theory I can pinpoint that I took away from the novel. I think this is like a novel that I have to reread one more time, or like treat it as a philosophical text and like analyze it instead of just reading it. And so, yeah, these are all the books I read in August. I read a lot in August. I don't know how I did that. I think it's because I started posting videos twice a week instead of once a week, so I have more time to read. I think the books I chose this month are also just easier to read, like Ripe, Yellowface, Katabasis are all books that just like suck me in, and I'm like reading without knowing I'm reading those type of books, and so I didn't really struggle with focusing on reading these books. It also might be like my mental stamina is getting better because I'm reading more instead of scrolling. I don't know. But yeah, these are all the books I read in August. Let me know what books you've read in August and like what book has made the most impact on you this month. And if you're going to read any of these books in September. It's crazy. It's September already. That means like summer's almost over. Wow. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.